My wife stepped on something in the lake the next day. They found a body. A few years ago, when my daughter was a toddler, my wife and I used to take her to a nearby lake to picnic, swim, and just unwind. It was a peaceful spot, quiet, not too crowded, the kind of place where you could easily forget about the world for a while. One afternoon, after we'd finished eating, my wife decided to go for a quick swim while I stayed on the beach with our daughter. I watched her wade out into the water, the sun sparkling off the surface. A minute later, she suddenly stopped and turned to me, shouting something. At first, I couldn't make out what she said, but her expression was off. Then I heard her clearly. I think I just stepped on someone's face. I froze for a second, thinking maybe she was joking. But the look on her face wasn't playful, it was pale, almost terrified. She quickly started making her way back to the shore, her legs moving faster, like she couldn't get out of the water fast enough. When she got back to me, she was visibly shaken. She said that while she was swimming, her foot brushed against something soft, and at first, she thought it was a rock or a weird patch of seaweed. But when she pressed her foot down, she felt the unmistakable shape of a face beneath the water, a nose, an eye socket. She swore she felt the hollow of the eye. I considered going in to check it out, but something stopped me. The unease in my gut, maybe. We decided to pack up and leave right after that. The next day, the local news reported that a young boy who had been missing for days was found drowned in that same lake, not far from where we had been. He'd been there the whole time, just beneath the surface. To this day, my wife is convinced she stepped on his face. Stories number 2. Came across an incredibly creepy family a while back. Okay, I never really post anything on Reddit, mostly just reading, so please excuse me if I do or say anything that isn't common courtesy here. In around 2018-2019, I, 25F, at the time was 18-19, was living in Nebraska, where I grew up. I lived in the largest city in NE, but it was still essentially surrounded by corn and wheat fields. The city was expanding, so rich folks started building huge houses with giant properties on the edge of town as things proceeded to grow. All of that being said, I had a good friend whose parents' house was one of those big ones right on the blurring line between the fields and the city. My friends and I were constantly hanging out at his place because it was fun. They had tons of property to ride 4x4s on, a hot tub, a huge living room for us to watch sports and have reality TV binge sessions, etc. Plus, his parents were super cool and we could drink out there as long as we stayed at the house. It was tons of fun even though I was quite scared of the dark, so I would just not go outside after a certain time because there was little lighting and the nearest neighbor was about a mile away. I always felt a weird energy driving from his place if it was late at night, but never had anything happen until one night. The drive out there was a long winding two-way road that had thick trees on both sides, and you pass one of the city's largest cemeteries on the way. Barely any lighting, of course, besides the street lamps every once in a while, and very little traffic. It's all inherently a bit creepy, and I'll admit to having sped through this section of road many times to get through it as quickly as possible. This specific night was perfect spring weather, so I was driving with my windows down listening to music, and it was around 10 p.m. I was coming around one of the curves in the road when I had to essentially slam my brakes on. Right in front of me in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards away, was what looked like a family. Again, picture a completely pitch-black road with thick forest on both sides and only my headlights to show what's in front of me. This was a family of 3-4, a tall, slim woman, an average height/weight man, a child, short hair but couldn't tell the gender based on the clothing and couldn't see their face, maybe around 8 years old, and the mother was pushing a fucking stroller. Their clothes looked normal, not tattered but not nice. They also were not carrying any kind of light source, meaning before I arrived behind them in my car, they had been walking in the pitch black. They were all facing away from me, walking completely silent in the middle of the street the same direction I was heading. I had turned my music down to hear if they were speaking, had music playing, etc. They didn't. The hairs on my arms immediately stood up. I came to a stop in the road behind them, obviously, and just sat there for a moment to let them move. They seemed to be completely unaffected by me and didn't even turn their head slightly, nor did they attempt to move out of my way. I literally thought I was going insane, or that I was dreaming. It was so surreal. Before I really had time to fully process and register what I was seeing and how truly strange it was, they all, at the same time, stopped walking and very slowly turned to face my car. This scared the absolute shit out of me. I honestly didn't even give myself enough time to look at their faces as they turned. I immediately threw my car in reverse and sent it backwards for probably a full 20 seconds before flipping a U-turn, nearly running myself off the road, and booking it the other direction. The only thing I remember noticing is that the stroller looked to be completely empty. This was the part that sticks in my mind the most. I've never felt terror like that in my life. I checked my rearview mirror probably 1,000 times before getting to a main road and never saw a glimpse of them. In fact, I never saw a glimpse of them ever again. I tried asking my friend and his family about it, only to essentially feel like I was insane because of the way they looked at me. Every time I tell this story I get one of three reactions. They immediately think I'm fucking cuckoo, think I'm lying, or have had something sort of similar happen to them. I really don't care if no one believes me, honestly. It was, and still is, the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. I think about it all the time. It was either some weird-ass family trying to scare the shit out of someone, a distraction for an attempted robbery/assault/etc., or it was something more sinister. I'm going to tell myself for probably the rest of my life that it was the first option. Stories number 3. I work in a haunted mansion literally. I'm a behavioral health technician. I got a new job back in September at what's considered a luxury drug and alcohol rehab facility. The facility is a huge mansion that on the outside looked like a mix of the Bank's Bel Air mansion on Fresh Prince or a mini White House. It's 3 levels, has 13 rooms that all have private bathrooms with jacuzzi tubs. There's a gym, 3 living room, a huge commercial kitchen, a ballroom, yoga studio, doctor office, huge garden, and an elevator. My first week I had 2 clients tell me it's haunted and I laughed it off. My schedule is 11 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. so majority of the time all the clients are asleep and it's just me and a nurse in this huge house, so it's quiet. My office is on the 2nd floor. Nurse's office along with the kitchen and huge pantry are on the 1st floor. The pantry is locked at all times and the nurse has the key. Couple weeks ago, the nurse comes stomping up the stairs yelling at me saying I scared her hiding in the pantry. I'm lost because I hadn't left my office, and when I tell her that she goes pale. And she's like, you weren't just in the pantry, and yelled knock knock. I say no, how could I be when you have the key? She walks out. 10 minutes later I hear her talking, so I go down to her office and she's down on her knees praying in Punjabi. At 6 a.m. the chef and handyman clock in, ask how was our night, and I jokingly say Casper scared Nurse J in the pantry. The chef says ooh, that's K. If it was in the pantry I'm like WTF? He then goes on to say he's worked here for 15 years and it used to be a retirement home, so lots of residents passed away here. He named off certain residents and where their ghost has been seen, saying they've always been kind, not malicious type hauntings, etc. Nurse J put in her 2 weeks notice and is no longer here. I hear footsteps, lights flicker and the fireplaces randomly come on, but I haven't had anything actually speak to me like Nurse J though. My pay is significantly higher than average and my supervisor say it's because he can't keep NOC shift staffed. I think it's because it's haunted and my pay is too good to scare me away. Stories number 4. I watched my coworker get arrested and then found out he had a sinister plan for me. I worked with this man for a little over 3 years. We worked pretty closely on some projects over the last 2 years and even sat near one another at work. In September I showed up and saw about 10 detectives at my place of work. I was a bit startled as this was quite unusual for my area. I looked around and saw that my coworker was in handcuffs and looked quite disheveled, which wasn't out of the norm to be honest. I walked up to the detectives, introduced myself and let them know who I was in relation to him. I asked what was going on and they filled me in on why he was currently being arrested. For the sake of the case I won't share more than he was a disgusting person. Over the course of the next 3 hours, I watched as they dismantled his workstation, went through his belongings, took evidence pictures and so on. I was pulled in and out of rooms answering questions about his character, what I knew of him and my feelings about him as a person. I told them he gave me a weird feeling in my gut. That I've always told my husband I wouldn't be surprised if the cops ever did come looking for him. That my husband even thought he was weird, and if I ever went missing that he'd be the first person to be suspected, didn't realize how real this almost was. The detective on site told me that they served a search warrant at his home and were looking there for any evidence. It sounds like they found more than they anticipated and were looking to see if there was anything else, unrelated to what they were currently investigating. I was asked my name and my husband's name for confirmation for something they found, which I did think was odd, but I let it go and called my husband to update him on the happenings of the day thus far. However, the last hour I was pulled in for the final time and advised by one of the lead detectives, who couldn't even look at me, that I needed to ensure I was safe and protected in the event they didn't book him that day. Come to find out, he had been journaling about me over the course of at least a year, saying he wanted to be with me, but the problem was that I was married. His journal then lined out a plan to set my husband up for cheating on me. And the end resulted in my death, caused by him, my coworker. The officer said that everything in between was viler than he's ever heard, to the point he was crying when he was telling me to make sure I was safe, crying, a detective, and didn't want to scare me. Thankfully, he was charged and looking at a long time in prison. But I still think about it. It keeps me up at night. It just shows you never really know someone, even your coworkers. Stories number 5. I was shocked when I found out that I hadn't dreamed it. A few days ago, I was sitting with my parents in their house. Suddenly, the topic turned to paranormal things because recently, something strange has been happening to my mother. My mother began reminding my father of the time when we were walking to my grandmother's house one evening, my father, mother, sister, and me. I was the youngest then, only 6 years old. A woman dressed in white, holding a bowl in her hands, appeared in front of the 4 of us. We all froze in that moment. The woman, in her white dress, was floating in the air, and her legs weren't visible beneath the dress. She quickly turned toward the wheat field beside us, and we could see the waves in the wheat as she moved through it. My father began to follow her while we, in my mother's arms, waited to see what would happen. Beyond the wheat field was a river. My father reached the river, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. She couldn't have crossed the river, so where did she disappear? My father returned, pale, looked at my mother, and simply told us to keep walking. While my mother was telling this story, I jumped out of my chair and said that I had always thought I had dreamed it, and that this dream had haunted me for years, because I still remember it as clearly as day. My mother said that it really did happen, and from that day, she no longer looked at the world the same way. My father was as pale as he was that day, terrified by the mere thought of the event. Stories number 6. Camping incident last year. So me and my best friend try to go camping once a year. We have been doing this since we were 13 years old. Never really been truly scared or had anything weird happen until last year in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We showed up during peak season the first night and space was very limited. We were losing light, so we set up camp on a spot on the side of the mountain that was an absolute wind tunnel. Morning came, so we went into town, drank beers and dicked around until late afternoon. By the time we got back up to the mountains to switch our camping spot, we were losing light again, but managed to find a more remote spot. We get set up with our tents, get the fire going and start drinking again. Time goes by, it's probably 1 a.m. when we see a flashlight aimed at us. And then it starts walking our way. We don't really think much of it and assume it's likely a park ranger coming to fuss at us about something, because who else walks up on you in a remote part of the mountains at 1 a.m.? I don't know about you, but ever since I started camping, I learned it's kind of an unspoken rule that you don't walk up on someone camping that late at night unless it's an emergency. Anyways, the person gets close enough and we realize it's just some guy, probably early 50s, in a shirt and basketball shorts, and his girl 40s, who is avoiding eye contact with us. The man immediately forces a conversation about nothing, doesn't acknowledge the time or his girl. His eyes were darting all over the place while we're talking to him about dumb shit like what model or style of lantern we had and how cool it was. He's saying weird stuff like how he used to be former law enforcement, completely out of context of the random conversation he engaged us in, when all of a sudden he pretends to land his flashlight on our tents and says, "Oh, that's where you guys are sleeping, huh? Cool setup." The way his eyes and flashlight are moving gives us both the feeling that he's trying to see how many of us were there. and what we had on us or near us because his eyes and flashlight kept scanning the ground around us. We were getting sized up, for what I don't know. Once this guy sees everything around us he kind of pauses for a minute, ends the conversation and walks off into the woods. Once his flashlight disappears, me and my friend look at each other and without me saying anything he looks at me and says we're packing our shit and getting out of here. So we did. This was the most unsettling thing I have ever had happen while camping. I think this guy was going to wait until we were asleep and come back. I just don't know for what, but I do know we were 100% getting sized up that night. Might not seem like much, but if you have ever had a moment with another human being who was sizing you up you'll know what I'm talking about. Stories number 7. The moment I realized how naive I am. I work night shifts at a liquor store. There are some customers who come and ask for almond chocolate, nothing else, and walk away. I asked my manager to order more almond chocolates since it's highly requested at night. My manager seemed surprised. During the day they barely sell any almond chocolate. One night an odd guy walks in, asks for almond chocolate. I reply, I'm sorry, we are out. Then he starts crying. He is going items frantically. He says I need aluminum foil now. I ask him to leave the store. I sit down to relax and I Google aluminum foil and almond chocolate. Turns out they do drugs using the aluminum foil. It's well known in the drug community chocolates with nuts are wrapped in foil to prevent turning stale. My fat ass would have never thought someone is more excited about the wrapping than the chocolate. Stories number 8. Still creeps me out every time I think of it. A few years ago, fall/early winter of 2019, we were staying with my husband's father. We rented/moved into a house a couple of months later, but had been staying there less than a week at the time this happened. I slept in the living room, on an air mattress, with our kids, ages 10, 5, 1. The kitchen, dining room, and living room were all open space. There was a wide counter sink that was a bar on the living room side. He never had stools or used it like that, though. Always had a sofa pushed right up to it. And had storage for dishes and whatever in the kitchen side. On each end of that counter, there was about 4 or 5 feet of open space between it and the wall. Along the wall directly opposite the front door, were 3 doors, father-in-law's bedroom, bathroom, spare room, from left to right. My husband slept on the tiny spare bed. His dad kept the door to his room closed and usually had a TV and, depending on the weather, either a space heater, window AC unit, or at least one fan going. I don't remember if my husband had the door to the room he was sleeping in open or closed that night. Except for that back wall, where the bedrooms and bathroom were, the house had windows all the way around it. Large, floor-to-ceiling windows along the front and a line of large, sliding windows along each side wall. It was originally built as a sort of camp/getaway cabin. Windows equals view. Apparently, he disagreed and was in the process of building a front porch, and replacing about half of those windows with wall. However, at the time, the porch was still being built and none of the windows had been changed or taken out yet. This particular night, I was holding my 18-month-old, with a child on each side of us. We had all been asleep for a while when I woke up. I'm not sure what time it was, but the house was mostly quiet and no one else was awake. I lay there, quietly, without moving around, for a little while and couldn't figure out why I was awake at all, much less so alert. Not long after I decided it was just one of those things, sleep cycles blah blah blah, and was about to try to go back to sleep, someone knocked on the front door. Not a loud, banging, beating knock, but definitely a knock. The air mattress was in the middle of the living room area, and the door was on the kitchen side of that dividing counter. I really didn't want to answer the door for multiple reasons. Was in the middle of 3 sleeping children, it was late, it was cold and we were cozy and warm all snuggled together. It wasn't my house/company and no one else seemed to notice someone was knocking. The knocking went on for longer than I would have knocked on someone's door in the middle of the night, and did get more persistent, though never did turn into banging. No one called out for somebody to answer the door, and no one's cell rang. Finally, I heard someone walking down the unfinished porch. They had stacked some boards and tools and stuff against the front of the house. I heard no clatters or thumps or anything like that, but it did sound like whoever was out there was having to walk on and around those building materials. And then I heard a distinct and firm tapping on the window closest to the kids and me. There was a small, older TV and a small stereo/speakers sitting on two small tables, about nightstand size. Actually, the one holding the TV was an old nightstand I had given him years before, between the air mattress and the windows. I was facing away from the window, but the tapping was right there where our heads were. An entire wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, and the tapping was done only in the area that would have been in my direct line of sight if I hadn't been facing the other direction. I don't think I took a single breath until it stopped and I heard footsteps walking away, and they walked across tin. All the way to the end of the porch, where the driveway was. Walking across sheets of tin makes a pretty distinct sound. I know exactly what it sounds like when someone walks on tin. What I did not realize until the next morning was that the only sheets of tin out there were already in place because they had finished putting it up as a roof over the porch before stopping for the evening, which meant that there were no sheets of tin stored against the wall/under the windows with those boards and tools and whatever else that was there. The only way for someone or something to have walked across those sheets of tin, which I am certain, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that I heard happening after hearing an unknown someone knock and tap for so long it became unsettling rather than annoying, would have been for them to jump/swing up onto the top of the house/porch, from an incomplete porch floor, and then jump back down at the end. It scares me in a way nothing else ever has and still does every single time I accidentally think about it. And that's why I'm typing this right now, and probably also why an owl chose just now to let loose the most terrifying, snow-like sound before transitioning into its usual eerie owl sounds. Stories number 9. True EMS horror story. I worked as a dispatcher for a pretty small ambulance station near a fairly large city in the middle of the US. How specific I can be since this is a true story, and I'm going to tell one of the craziest stories I have from this job. We had a patient who we will call Susan. She was a dialysis patient and one of the services we offered was to take very unwell or disabled patients to and from these dialysis appointments. She lived with her son who we will call David. He was in his late 40s and his mother, Susan, in her late 70s or so. Every week like clockwork, we would have a unit bring Susan to and from her dialysis treatments 3 times a week. Everyone knew her at the station because we had been doing this for quite some time with Susan. We were all familiar with her and her son, whether it was the crew seeing her in person and taking care of her, or speaking to her or her son on the phone frequently about the appointments as I had done. Everyone knew her. Naturally, when crews had news about her health they would report back to keep everyone in the loop with how she was. At one point she was not feeling well at all. But she wanted to go to her dialysis appointment, so naturally we obliged and took her in. At this appointment while receiving dialysis treatment, she lost consciousness and was promptly taken by our crew to the hospital. When it was time again for her dialysis appointment, we gave the hospital a call to see if she had been released and was able to go to the appointment. The hospital staff informed us that she would likely be released the following day and would be receiving that dialysis treatment in the hospital. Then the next treatment time rolled around and we called the hospital and we were told she had been released from their care the other day. This was great news but a little strange due to the fact that we were always her first call to transport her to or from any hospital or appointment and we hadn't transported her anywhere. We quickly moved on however and called David her son to see if she was going to be requiring us for her treatment that day. He informed us she wasn't feeling well and that she wasn't up to it, but that he was considering taking her back into the hospital. We tell him that if he needs us to just give us a call and until further notice we cancel her trip for the day. We never get a call. Next appointment rolls around and we call David again to ask if she will be going. He says she's sick and she's back in the hospital. Weird again since we hadn't taken her but doesn't seem that off considering her health had been deteriorating. Next appointment, same thing happens. We call David, his mom's in the hospital, we move on. Now is where things took a bit of a turn. When the next appointment came up we had tried calling David to ask about his mother's status but he never answered or returned our calls. So, being that we had a contract with Susan and were to take her to these appointments unless told otherwise, we sent a crew to collect her for treatment. When the crew arrived at scene, they knocked on the door to no response. They knocked again and were greeted by David smoking a cigarette. David seeming surprised, the crew said they were there to pick up Susan for her appointment. David responded stating he had forgotten to call, but Susan was still in the hospital not doing well. The crew gave their best wishes and David shut the door. But the crew felt like something was off. They immediately radioed to dispatch that something was wrong and they requested we call the hospital David said she was at to see if she was still there. The hospital had no record of her being there since we last knew. So we had the crew leave the scene and we called for a welfare check on Susan at her son's home. We heard nothing the rest of the day from police, David, Susan, or anyone else involved. The next morning I came into work and the very first call I took began with, "This is Sheriff with. I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you asked us to perform yesterday." I was nervous as he sounded concerned and I didn't really expect them to call us back with any news. He proceeded to let me know that upon arrival to the home they spoke with David, who was adamant his mother didn't feel well but that she was home from the hospital. The police asked to just check on Susan to make sure she was all right and eventually David obliged, letting the police in. Once entering the home they were met with a grim scene, though I imagine they smelled it first. They continued to explain that what the officers observed was the dead body of Susan propped up on the couch wrapped in blankets, as if watching the television. But she had been dead for a while. They approximated around 2 weeks. When speaking to David, they found that he had been changing her clothes regularly and watching TV with her. Obviously he was suffering from some sort of mental issue and grief, but the thing was, he had never taken good care of her until she was dead. No news coverage, no updates from police further than that, nothing. Stuff like this happens in your hometown and you'll never know. Crazy, right? Stories number 10. The monster that married my mom. This is a story that happened when I was very young. It started around the time I was 5 back in the 80s and was the beginning of the worst 5 years of my life. I was a teenage unplanned pregnancy, so my mom was a single mom for the first few years of my life. It wasn't too bad though. My mom and I were not alone. We lived with my mom's parents, my grandparents. My mom's younger sister was also still living at home. We were safe and happy. Then my mom met a guy, let's call him Joe for privacy purposes. Joe seemed like a dream come true. He was nice to me and my mom. He took us places and brought us gifts. It was awesome, and when he proposed my mom and I were both happy. They got married and my mom thought we would now be a happy family. We didn't know how wrong we were. It started off great. At first we had left my grandparents and moved into a home together. We had some really good times, but things took a turn for the worse after the first few months. Joe had a really bad temper and it would come out when my mom or I upset him. He would yell, throw things, and break stuff. Then he started hitting my mom and me. He would punch and kick us. He got worse and worse. He started beating me up to get back at my mom. It was a nightmare for 3 years. My mom was too scared to leave him or tell on him. I was too small when I told people, thought I was lying, because I wanted to go back to my grandparents' house. The weirdest thing was Joe was a lot like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We had some really good times, vacations, holidays, and more. When he was nice it was amazing. When his other side came out it was hell. We did finally have something good and bad happen. My mom was pregnant. She was happy to be a mom again and I was excited to be a big brother. It was also bad though, because we were further tied to Joe and who knew what he would do to the baby. When my baby brother was born things were good for a while. We were pretty happy. I had withdrawn a lot though. I stayed in my room watching TV and reading. I figured out of sight, out of mind. I thought if I avoided Joe he wouldn't bother me. I should have continued this plan, but I was blinded with the happiness and peace that came with my brother's birth. It all started back one day. Joe had a toothache and was in a foul mood. He had been yelling at my mom all day. My brother was teething and had been fussy, so Joe was extra grumpy, yelling at her to get the baby quiet. My mom called me to dinner and I walked out of my room. I was walking slowly and quietly, because I didn't want to make Joe any more upset. Well, I guess I went too slow and got in the way, because he got mad, yelled and threw the remote control and hit me in the side of the head and eye. It was terrible. I was bleeding and bruised. My mom had finally had enough and left him with me and my brother. We went to my grandparents' house. They took pictures of my eye and called the police, but they wouldn't do anything. Social services investigated, but they didn't do anything either. We were happy at my grandparents and safe, but Joe was very slick. He called my mom and said the right words and after a while talked her into coming back with promises to be better. He actually was for a while, but then he went back to his old ways. He even tried to beat my brother. I took a lot of beatings for him, because I love him and wanted to protect him. It all came crashing down one December night when I was 9. My mom had forgotten to pay the phone bill and the phone got turned off. She was at work working a double second and third shifts and Joe was due to go into the same plant for his third shift in a different department. He was enraged when he found out the phone was off. He dragged me out of bed and we drove up the store just up the road from our house. He called my mom at work on the pay phone. He was yelling and cussing at her about the phone bill. Then he said something that sent chills down my spine. He told her if she didn't get home in an hour he would kill me. I was terrified. We went back to the house and I went to my room. Joe kept ranting and raving. I was so scared he called me into the living room and attacked me. He was beating me with a belt all over. He grabbed me and threw me into a wall. He pulled the chin cabinet down on top of me. Then he grabbed a broom and continued to beat me. The beating kept up on and off for several hours. I was in pain and covered in bruises and blood. It was time for him to go to work. He got dressed to go and told me that if I went to school in the morning he would beat me when I got home. I guess he knew with all my wounds the school would do something. I was scared, but I needed help. I couldn't change out of my pajamas, because I hurt too much. I slowly limped my way to my bus stop barefoot and still in my Incredible Hulk pajamas. The bus driver pulled up, opened the door, took one look at me and got me on the bus and immediately drove to school. Then everything moved so fast. Before I knew it I was talking to social services and the police. They ended up taking me to my grandparents who got custody of me. I was happy to be with my grandparents whom I love and happy to be safe, but I missed my mom and my brother. Strangely enough the police never did anything to my stepfather. It was a different time I guess. It was a few more years before my mom got the courage and left him, but she finally did. She ended up meeting a high school sweetheart and getting remarried. She and my brother finally had a happy life like I did and we were back in each other's life. I found out later that my stepfather had been orphaned at the young age of 5 when his parents and older sister died when his dad's small plane crashed. He was then raised by a very physically and mentally abusive aunt and uncle. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains it. I eventually ran into him on social media. I forgave him and let go of the anger and hurt I had been holding on to. He had gotten a lot of mental help and seemed to be doing good. I convinced my brother to talk to him, because Joe was his biological dad and Joe had found his mom's family and extended members of his dad's family whom he lost touch with when his parents died. I told my brother that it would be good for him to meet some of his family from his father's side as he had never met them. I don't know my dad at all and would have loved to have that connection. As Joe continued to change and work hard to be better, I strangely enough became his biggest cheerleader. He would come to me for advice or to get me to mediate between he and my brother if they bumped heads, as their relationship tended to be rocky. My brother is like my mom, he holds on to grudges a long time. I don't know who I am like, being willing to forgive and forget. I know some of you will think I am crazy for forgiving him and actually helping him, but it really brought me an inner peace. And also I took pity on him for what he had been through as a child. That kind of trauma could turn anyone into a monster. Which is why I went to lots of therapy to help me get over mine. Stories number 11. Thought it was my toddler. This was a few years back, but from time to time, I still have an eerie feeling. For background, I sleep in my son's room in a separate bed as he has autism and needs me in the night a lot. When he was a toddler, I had him in a toddler bed with that half-guard rail thing. He would wake in the middle of the night and crawl on the floor giggling because he knew he was being a sneaky little bugger. So one night, I had a feeling like someone sat on the edge of my bed. I turned over and saw my son crawling around on the floor, like he usually does. So I told him get back in bed, and literally as soon as I said that I heard a snore. I look back over at his bed and he is lying there asleep. I looked back on the floor and nothing was there. The update to this now my son is older is that I used to feel the something sit on edge of my bed feeling all the time, then it stopped for like several years. But recently I've been feeling the something sitting on edge of my bed feeling again. Stories number 12. I hugged a murderer who was also my pastor. So I grew up going to a Christian church from birth. Very small family like we loved it as kids. In 2008 so I was about 9 years old at this time. We found out that someone had committed suicide in our church. It was super strange and unexpected for the church people. A few months later we found out that the pastor's wife passed away. He beat her and tried to stage a car accident. When she passed away our pastor threw her a memorial service at the church. On that Sunday me and my family showed up to show support for him and her family. You know how at funerals people stand in a line and you usually walk up and hug them. Yeah, same thing here, we walk away and give our respects and I hugged him. He got away with it for over a year before people started questioning the whole situation. That whole time he was still preaching our church and just continuing on his life. So fast forward a little and they realize my pastor killed his wife. But then some people start questioning the death of his first wife from 1999. Y'all. This man killed 2 wives. Got away with one and almost got away with the second one. The person who committed suicide we later also found out he killed himself because the pastor was also having an affair with another member of the church who was also married. I was not only close to this man but I slept in the same house as him on our Bible retreats and such. Super creepy and makes me have a lot of trust issues. Stories number 13. Happened when I was a kid but still traumatizes me. Edit. This happened when I was a little girl about 9 or 10. One summer evening when I was about 9 or 10, there was a bad accident about 2/10 of a mile from our farmhouse. The accident was at the corner of 2 roads. We lived way out in the country in the Midwest. We weren't home when it happened but could see the aftermath later that evening. The next day out of curiosity, I asked my mom if I could ride my bike up to the corner. She said yes, but don't go further. She was hanging laundry on the clothesline and kept an eye on me as I rode up. We lived in a really safe area where my brother and I rode our bikes all the time so I wasn't scared. I get to the corner and get off my bike and start looking around at some of the leftover debris. Nothing much, but as a kid you're just curious. As I'm looking around, 2 creepy guys in a station wagon pull up. I felt bad vibes right away. They asked me which one of them was cuter. All I could think is to run, hop on my bike and ride as fast as I could towards home. Fortunately, their car was facing west on a gravel road and I was headed east down a blacktop road so I got a little head start. As I looked back, I could see them turn around and start following me. I started screaming at the top of my lungs as I was pedaling as fast as I could. My mom saw me and started running towards me. When the car got a little way down our road and saw my mom, they stopped, turned around again and headed the other direction. My mom called the police but not a lot they could do but they did take the info. To this day, that whole incident and their faces are burned in memory. When I hear stories of little girls being abducted, I think that could have been me. Stories number 14. Creepy hunting encounter. I once held a hunting lease in Middle Georgia. It was an abandoned hunting camp that hadn't been used in several years. I'm not superstitious at all but this place was legitimately spooky. It was miles down an overgrown dirt road and completely surrounded by woods. It's probably the most secluded place I've ever been. I used to hunt there by myself a lot and there was always this weird sense that I wasn't alone out there. There was a locked gate at the front of the property but it was not uncommon for us to find the front door of the cabin open, even when the door was locked. That was pretty creepy but that's not what this story is about. One evening I was hunting down in a small valley by a food plot we put lining a creek that bordered the property. From the minute I sat down I had a weird feeling. Like I wasn't in a safe place even though I was holding a .308 with ballistic tipped rounds. I didn't feel like I was the top predator out there. I didn't see any deer while I was sitting the stand but the forest was abuzz with activity. Birds, squirrels and other critters singing their normal evening symphony and then all of a sudden, silence. Everything just stopped. It felt like everything in the woods were looking right at me. It was getting dark fast anyways and I was extremely creeped out, so I packed up my gear and started the walk back up to the cabin. About 100 yards away I had this feeling that something was coming up behind me. I spun around and pointed my rifle back down the path towards the food plot, and that's when I saw it. There was something standing in the middle of the path. It wasn't a person, but it didn't look like a deer or anything I've seen before. There was hardly any light to make out any features, but it almost looked like some kind of bipedal deer or something. It was just standing there, staring at me. I quickly made my way back to the cabin, packed up my stuff and got out of there. I just let the lease run out. Never went back after that. Stories number 15. She poisoned me. Glad you're alive. My parents got married while still in high school. I wouldn't recommend this, the 12th grade to be exact. They were legal adults. I came just a year later when my mom was 19 and my dad was 20. We lived in a one-bedroom upstairs apartment in a crappy complex. I slept in my crib until I started climbing out of it and finding my way into my parents' bed or into trouble. When I was 4, my parents decided I needed my own room, so they upgraded to a 2-bedroom downstairs apartment in the same complex. They fought horribly all the time, but outside of that everything was pretty normal. I made a few friends with other children around the complex, and a cousin and her 3 kids also lived in the complex. I wrote about my evil cousin here. Everything was fine until a new neighbor moved in next door when I was 6. Immediately this lady didn't like me and she didn't hide it. I was at school when she moved in, but on the weekends when I went out to ride my big wheel bike and play, she stood in her door and glared at me with the most hateful look a person could give a child. To be honest, I didn't like her either. Something about her bothered my spirit greatly, though at the time I didn't understand why. It's like she could sense my presence outside and would literally spawn outdoors just to glare daggers at me and mutter things under her breath. I felt an evil presence on her and started making a cross with my fingers whenever I saw her. This enraged her and she lied and told my mom that I threw her a middle finger. My mom believed me instead. Strange things started happening in my room at night. I had a rocking horse. It was beautiful and I enjoyed playing on it. However, it started rocking on its own whenever I tried to sleep. My parents heard this as the springs made a distinctive noise. I had one of those dolls that eyes open and close depending on if it's lying down or sitting up. The doll's eyes would sometimes remain open while lying down, or it would blink, scaring the crap out of me. There would be strange knocking noises in my wall. My parents heard this as well and they permitted me to sleep with them in bed. One day my mom and I got locked out of our apartment. This was before everyone had cell phones, 90s, and our cousin wasn't home. My mom, against my pleas, knocked on the neighbor's door to use her phone. She let us in, glaring at me the entire time. I never let go of mom's hand or came from behind her leg. In her house, on her wall were multiple upside-down crosses. Strange-looking masks, some with horns. There were candles everywhere and small colorful bottles with powder in them. My mom looked around like WTF, but kept her composure. She held my hand tighter, made the phone call to my dad at his job to hurry back now, and we quickly exited the apartment after thanking the woman. She watched me as we left. My mom told my dad everything and he told his father, my grandfather, who was a pastor. He immediately brought us a bottle of prayed-over olive oil, holy oil, to anoint our house. My mom also told her side of the family, who were very strict Christians, and they were, for a lack of a better word, flabbergasted, and started a prayer meeting. A few days later we noticed at our back door a white powder substance across the threshold. My mom poured some of the oil on it and it absorbed it and disappeared. The woman later tried to offer me some candy, which I declined, though I loved sweets. My nickname was Sugar Ant because I loved junk so much. I had made friends with a little girl in the complex that lived on the other side. One day she had some soft chews and offered me one. Like an idiot I accepted and ate it. It didn't take long before I fell violently ill. Fever, sweating, skin darkened, dark circles around the eyes. Nothing given to me at the doctors helped. I couldn't keep anything down. On intuition my mom asked did I accept and eat anything from anyone, and I confessed to accepting candy from a friend. She asked around and found out the girl was the granddaughter of our next door neighbor. My dad called over my grandfather and my mom her family. They anointed me with holy oil and made a prayer circle around me and started speaking in tongues. I was in and out of consciousness. My grandfather lifted me up and made me drink some of the oil. I remember it burning my throat. Suddenly I had to throw up. I leaped from the couch where I was laying and sprinted to the bathroom, where I started throwing up a thick, black sludge. A lot came out. My mom was shaking and on the verge of tears. Everyone continued praying in tongues. I threw up for a while until it was all out. I suddenly felt a lot better. I was fussed at for accepting food from strangers, even friends. The adults talked while I rested. After a few days the woman saw that I was fine. This time I glared at her back as I was angry. I was young, but I understood she had tried to poison me for no reason. I made the cross sign again with my fingers and she went back in her house and slammed her door. She moved out some time after that. Stories number 16. My friend saved my life from a creature. I'll keep it long but informative. About 3 years ago my friend and I, 17 and 16 at the time, were having a bonfire behind my barn. It was a perfect night, no wind, hoodie weather. The fire was gigantic and lit up all the surrounding area. We were screwing around having a good time and got the idea to walk about 500 foot down to check out my pond, as part of the water was illuminated from the fire. We walked down joking about a skinwalker or some humanoid creature coming out of my woods. Let me get this straight, for years and years I've always told myself I want to see something, practically begging for something to happen so I can whip out my phone and record it. My friend always gets tensed up when I say anything about that stuff, so it's funny to me, especially since we were surrounded by woods in the middle of farmland country. We're down at the pond and I see him kinda notice something shiny about 20 feet to our right. Yes, after all this we measured everything, and I did too. He said, "Hey, where'd that giant rock come from?" I looked and immediately knew it wasn't a rock or anything, as I just mowed the area a few hours prior. The only thing around us were 2 full-grown trees. We started walking towards it, and as we got closer I kept saying, "What the hell is that?" He starts freaking out, yelling, "What the hell is that?" And I'm just in complete awe. By this point I'm about 5 feet from it and weighing out what it could be. Wasn't a rock, wasn't a tree stump, nothing should be here. It was about 3 feet long, maybe 2 feet high, and it immediately hit me. This is something crouched down like in a fetal position. I made out the neck and the torso, wrinkled grayish skin, little white hairs. I said it one more time, "What is this thing?" and my friend screamed in straight terror, grabbed me and pulled me away. We both ran up to my house, looking back, making sure it wasn't following. We ran in my house, told my mom, who obviously said, "Oh yeah?" I grabbed a flashlight and we got in my Civic and drove through the yard down to where it was. Headlights shined down and nothing. Nothing was there. We drove all around through my woods and found nothing. The next morning we went back, found no prints. The only thing I wish I'd done was take out my phone. It was right there, something was right there. When you're looking at something you know shouldn't be there, you don't have a thought. I never had one thought to pull out my phone. To this day my friend and I still talk about it, wondering what it was. Stories number 17. Mary. Grocery store overnights. I worked as a overnight grocery stocker manager for 19 years. This happened about 15 years ago. We were working on one of the nights where we didn't have a load, just doing back stock. Once a week one of our meat department employees would stay late and do deep cleaning. It was Mary's turn this week. It was a bit after midnight when Mary came up to me in tears, all shook up. She was telling me there was a man all dressed in black standing in the meat department, motioning for her to go to him. I grabbed another one of my employees to go look for this guy. We looked everywhere but didn't see anyone. I reassured Mary we looked everywhere but didn't see anyone else in the store, but I still felt a bit uneasy about the whole thing. Our closing manager always does a walk through to make sure no one is left in the store. Mary went back to work, but just a few minutes later came back up to me in panic mode, telling me he was back and motioning for her to come to him. Once again we went looking around and didn't see anyone there. I told Mary she could go home and not to worry about finishing her work. That morning when the store manager came in, I was telling her what had happened. She pulled up the camera footage and saw nothing weird. She told me that Mary told her a strange story a few nights before about a customer with a knife. We just thought maybe it was just Mary having too much stress. The next night I went into work and was told Mary had passed away that morning. She went home from work, went to bed and never woke up. It still runs through my head to this day, the weirdest thing that ever happened on my overnight shift. Stories number 18. I'm not going to hurt you. Remembering these words still sends a chill up my spine. This was a few years ago. My 33M husband, 43M, and I were getting gas late one night. This was a bit of a weird gas station, where two roads intersected at an angle with the gas station being on the acute angle, if you can picture that. At the pump we chose, there were no working lights and it was difficult to see directly from either road. We were driving a soft-top Jeep Wrangler with all of the rear windows taken off. My husband got out to pump, and I was sitting in the passenger seat looking at my phone. That's when I heard it. "I'm not going to hurt you," a wavery voice said some distance behind me. I froze, suddenly terrified. I turned around to look out the empty space where our back window used to be, and saw what appeared to be a homeless man a little way off. He had slightly wild gray hair, a washed-out beanie, and an oversized jacket with lots of pockets that hid his hands. I suddenly realized how dark it was, and how hard it was for anyone to see us. And I couldn't see his hands. I had a distinct feeling from deep down, so prominent I could almost hear it. "Run, but we're just pumping gas. He's just a weird homeless dude." My husband and I were from Key West. We had seen plenty of them before and they were almost all harmless. So, I slowly turned back around and went back to my phone. Yet I still heard him. The distinct sound of shuffling feet. The rustle of his jacket. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said again. "I just need some help. Do you have any money? I'm not going to hurt you." At this point I could tell he was almost at the Jeep. We had only been there a couple of minutes, and we'd been on almost empty. There was no way the tank was full. Without warning, my husband rushed into the car and hurried to start the engine. I could tell his hands were shaking. He managed to throw the car into drive and we peeled out of there. I looked behind us and saw the man standing there, not reacting, next to the dangling nozzle my husband hadn't bothered hanging back up. As we turned out of the gas station, my husband said, "I just had the most horrible feeling. Something in me just told me to run." I looked at him in horror, and told him I'd felt the same thing. I felt tears come to my eyes as I thanked him for listening to his instincts. We went home feeling quite shaken, just going over the events we had just seen and the fear we had felt. It was a day or two later that we watched a YouTube video by a security analyst, Scott Stewart, on the Kenyan Mall shooting. And he said that in every event like this there are people who said, right before it happened, "I had a terrible feeling that something bad was about to happen." He adds that some people listen to that feeling and leave the area, while others mention how much they regret not listening to it. I burst into tears hearing this, knowing the feeling he had described all too well. I had had that feeling, and was one of those who ignored it. I remember crying, "Thank you," at my husband for listening to his sense of danger. Now, it is fully possible this was just a harmless person, asking for money in a slightly creepy way, and that nothing bad would have happened. But, I can't stop remembering how the weird angles kept anyone from seeing us. I can't stop thinking about how dark it was. And I can't stop thinking about his hidden hands. And I still get full-body chills remembering him say, "I'm not going to hurt you." Moral of the story, I guess, if you ever get that distinct feeling that something bad is imminent, leave the area. It may be a false alarm, and if it happens a lot you may have a hyperactive anxiety response and might want to try Lexapro. But it's better than going through the rest of your life wishing you had listened to that feeling. Stories number 19. How my friend and I were stalked for years and nearly kidnapped. First part of this story got deleted, so I'm going to shorten it. Basically, a summer camp me and my friend started to attend in 2019 does surveys every summer based on the topic we'll be discussing so we get better public speaking and a more generalized opinion from others in the area. Me and my friend teamed up with 2 counselors and hit the town. Our last stop was a Walmart, and we talked to a bunch of different people. The most memorable was the second to last, an older man that asked for our names and all about us after he finished answering our questions. At the time, we were both 13 with hardly any concept of stranger danger, so we gladly answered about ourselves. Anyway, a few days later an account popped up on our friend requests called ed_patsis. The account liked a bunch of old posts, commented a buccino of fire and rose emojis and called us hot and sexy on our posts. It got to the point where they started to send pics. So, me and my friend ended up blocking the account. Only a few days later, the account was permanently deleted. It didn't show up in our searches for it. That's why we thought it was the end of it. It was not. When we finally got back to school in August, we basically forgot the event altogether. Yet, again, this time on both of our Facebook accounts, we got a notice from someone named ed_patsis wanting to be our friend. Immediately blocked that account again, but not before they had already commented lewd things on my baby pictures, commented on how pretty my baby blonde hair was, how I looked good in short dresses, etc. After that, we both talked to our parents about the situation, and other than keeping our accounts private there wasn't much else we could really do. The cops shrugged and said just to take the app down completely, but hey, we're teens. Of course we didn't do that. Over the years, till around the end of 2021, this man kept sending friend requests from different accounts with similar variations of their names. Which was a bit stupid, but whatever. Though, at the beginning of 2022, this is where it starts to get really creepy. Accounts with the names and pictures of our friends started showing up in our notifications, so obviously, we added them thinking it was our friends. We were wrong. Almost immediately, most of our posts had likes or comments on them from this account and there were multiple DMs of pics to both of us. We blocked the account again. This became a reoccurring cycle. An account with friends info, pictures, and mutual friends would get hacked, stolen, duplicated, etc. Just so they could friend us again and again without us worrying too much about it. Finally, it got to the point we stopped adding people from our school at all, even friends. The final time this happened was in summer of 2022. The swarm of fake accounts had stopped roughly 2 months prior, and seeing as this friend request looked legit by a school friend I decided to try it out. My friend didn't, she was still wary, but I decided to give it a shot. The compromise was to fully delete our socials and get new ones if this account turned out the same. I was definitely a stupid 17-year-old, but try not to judge me too harshly. But this account didn't spam our pictures, didn't DM us pics, just interacted with us like any normal school kid would. A like here and there on new posts, a like on a story posted, never commented on posts. So, finally, we thought it was over. Wrong. Strange things started to happen and become more of an intentional thing than a coincidence. I would post a picture of me and a friend at the park. A couple minutes later a white truck pulled up in the lot. Eerily close to my car, driver's side door, but we tried not to think too much of it. There were still a few spaces over. Me and my friend were in the swings, basically straight line of sight of the parking lot. The truck lights remained on, pointed at us, for a long time. It got to the point that me and my friend finally started getting worried and anxious, so we hopped up from the swings and decided to take laps around the park instead. The car was far too close to mine for us to be comfortable chancing getting to it in time. Mind you, it was about 10 p.m. at night so we were the only ones there. We waited and roamed the park for nearly an hour before the truck finally drove away. That's when we raced to my car and I drove home, looking behind me frequently just in case. This happened in early June, and it kept happening. I didn't really notice it, thought it was a one-off occurrence. It never dawned in my head that it happened after I posted pictures or said where I was with friends. But I started to see a white truck just about anywhere I posted about. Even one that would wait outside my high school when I posted a story about my walk to my mom's store only a mile from our school. Again, young and dumb, I didn't think the worst of it. I thought it was parent waiting for a kid, plus, there is a bunch of people that own all kinds of variations of white trucks in my town. So, I never put much worrying into see them all the time. My friend never mentioned any white truck, and if we were together we rarely saw any of them. But I started to get nervous of them after one time I was walking to my mom's store. I decided to take a glance at the driver of the truck that sat near the car line every day after school. It was the same, if not a bit older, man from our Walmart survey trip of 2019. It was bizarre, definitely. We were never expecting to see him again, especially since we met him in a few towns over from our own. Yet, lo and behold, he was right there. That's when I walked, probably ran actually, to my mom's store. This kept happening, and I finally knew I was being stalked after seeing him that first time because I saw him everywhere on foot. Anyway, this post is getting long, so I'll fast forward to the last bit that happened on the last day of our shared summer camp in late July 2023. At this point, I was still 17, and since I was older than most of the new campers, I might as well have been considered a staff member. I drove kids to camp and home every night, and they paid me for the gas money, so I was cool with doing it. Didn't bother me, since they were in the same town as me and there was others farther away the counselors typically drove home. This day, I posted all the last day campfire pictures right before I left so I could try and save my phone that was suffering from glitches, lack of data, and didn't let me communicate/call others because my storage was too full. So I photo dumped a bunch of stuff, but it didn't fix the problem. My phone was essentially broken in all but name. It hardly worked, and I bought my current phone after this occurrence. On top of this, one of the older campers that visited on the last day, 19M, didn't have a phone either, but he was also in the car with me. In the back seat, I had 3 campers. One didn't have a phone either, and the other 2 were dead. One was charging theirs with my carport, but we didn't think much of it. Just turned on the radio full blast and gunned it back home. As I pulled off the back road of our camp up to the intersection, the light turned green and we went forwards. In the lane next to us was a white truck that kept turning its brights on and off. It was a bit weird, so I sped up, but I didn't think much of it. Side note, my best friend, let's call her and for this, has a baby. And had her kid at 16, so at this point her kid was nearly a year old. Still very fussy in car rides and such. This becomes important later, because and was there for the last day of camp too. She left right before we did when her baby became cranky. Eventually, I don't see the white truck behind me anymore and I slow down a bit. It was nearly 9:30 p.m. at this point, late enough for the highway between our towns to be essentially empty. I have this back road that is a bit curvy that leads close to my house and directly to a rich neighborhood. It's the streets I typically take to get back to my house from camp if I had no one to take home, and everyone that was a regular in my car called it the detour. It was quite pretty, with a bunch of full evergreen trees and wildlife. The kids, not really kids, but they acted like it. 13F, 15M, 15M, in the back were begging me to go on the detour, since it was the last day of camp. So I caved in and hit on my blinker, turning right onto the back road. Now, listen, I'm not the safest person out there, don't judge me. I'm still basically a kid too. But all the ones in the back loved to hang out the windows on the back road, so I let them stick their heads out the sunroof, sit on the windowsill while holding the bars on top of my car. I went slow, under 10 miles per hour, just so they could do it and not worry about them getting hurt. I mean, there was no one on the back roads. Cops never camped out on these streets, and I was going under the speed limit by like 20, so there wasn't really any harm in letting them stick out the windows. Eventually, I let them bully me into taking them around the rich neighborhoods that had cool water fountains and covered bridges on their streets. Apparently, one of the covered bridges caved in, so we had to go around on this super narrow street right next to a large drainage ditch at least 15 to 20 feet deep. As we are going around it, a car comes up behind us. I assumed it was one of the people who lived in the neighborhood, so I was gonna speed up to let them get to their house. Finally, we came to the four-way of the rich people street. Straight forward was a dead end, which is what I originally was gonna do. To the left was the broken covered bridge, and to the right was a back roundabout that would take us back to the beginning of the street, but it had no houses/lights back there because the neighborhood is still being built. But, let's call him Jake, 19M, told me to go right. Mind you, one of the campers was sticking their body out of my skylight from the back seat so I couldn't see out of my review mirror. I didn't really want to, but I trusted his instincts and turned right. As soon as I did, I started to hear honking behind me. I was a bit startled, and so were the kids in the back seat. I glance out in my side view mirrors but I can't see anything past bright LED lights. I thought it was just because I took too long, so I sped up a bit after I turned right. There was a hook at the end of a hill on this back street, and it makes you tug the steering wheel pretty hard to stay on the road, especially in the dark. The car behind me turned right too. They started flashing their LED brights, honking loudly, and had rolled down windows screaming at us. They kept trying to get in the lane next to us and bump into my car to run us off the road. That is when I knew this was serious. Instantly, I started screaming at the kids in the back seat to sit down, buckle up, and roll up their windows. They barely managed to do that by the time I hit the bend at the end of the hill really hard and gunned it off the street, driving around the drainage ditch with little problem. I've done it multiple times. There was no phone in the car to call anyone, least of all the police, so I just ended up speeding down the back streets as the car chased me, trying to run me off the road multiple times. When we came upon sharp corners, they slowed down. That told me they didn't know the area well, which I used to my advantage. As I was approaching a stop sign, for me to go left or right, my house was to the right, so left it was. I yelled at Jake to check my right because I'm not stopping for the sign. I sped past it, the car. This is about the time I noticed it was a fucking white truck, tried to hit my bumper again, and I swerved into someone's yard. Grass was damaged the next day when I drove past it. I booked it down the street, hitting every turn as fast as possible, and eventually I thought I lost the truck. I sped past my high school and onto the highway again, where we got off in the first place. I didn't see the truck behind us and we were all still freaked out. I took a right to go onto another main way, and passed by a closed gas station on the way, very important in a moment. I stopped at a gas station and handed the kids in the back some cash for them to go get themselves a drink and a snack to help them calm down. None of them were crying, thank God, the adrenaline junkies they are. They thought it was more exciting than anything. I told Jake to go watch them in the store and make sure they didn't do anything stupid while I filled up my gas tank. We waited at the gas station for about 20 minutes before I went back onto the road to take them home, just in case. I asked them if they had saw the car at all while they were hanging out the windows, and only one of them said they thought they did, but the truck's lights were off. It was the same truck from a town or so over, from the intersection in front of the back road to our camp. They followed us for nearly 25 minutes. After I dropped all of them off, I was still a bit shaky and decided to try and see if my phone would call someone that I could talk to about what happened. The only contact that would load was Anne, since she was the last person I had talked to on our phones. With a stroke of luck, my phone actually let me call. She picked up, but all I could hear from her side of the line was her crying. Obviously panicking, I asked her what was wrong. And lo and behold, she shares a story eerily similar to what just happened to me. Apparently, Anne's baby started crying so loud she could barely focus on the road. So she pulled into the closed gas station I mentioned earlier. Right outside our high school I sped past. She was giving her kid their bottle when a white truck pulled into the lot. Immediately she was weary because it was closed, and she was right. Less than 30 seconds later, this truck parked horizontally in front of Anne's car to block her in. She immediately started the car again, locked her doors, and pulled off over the grass curb blocking her from the street. She was not chancing her baby at all. And told me the only thing she remembered was the man that we had saw, years ago, in that Walmart. His eyes staring at her like she was just a piece of meat for him to have. As she raced home, the truck caught up to her. She turned on her back road, running out of gas, and the truck started to flash its lights, honk, run her off the road the entire time. But, a couple streets before hers, a little red car pulled out in front of her and started to brake check her as the white truck tried to hit her from behind. It was a mess. She took a chance, sped up, and swung onto her street to at least loose the red car. The truck booked it after her. Apparently, both of her older brothers were waiting outside for her with some of their friends to help her bring in stuff for her baby. Upon seeing this as she pulled into her driveway, the white truck sped off. If her brothers weren't outside, that would have been a different story. But, anyway, long story short, the truck that follows me all the way back had an accomplice in a red car that followed my friend Anne. When they couldn't catch me, they went for her. Both me and Jake suspected that, because I didn't go onto the dead end where the man could cut me off. That's probably why it suddenly got violent so quickly. If you want more of my story times that sound a bit crazy but sadly true, comment below. Edit. I never mentioned what happened after this. But the man in the white truck and the other in the little red car were found a town over when there was footage taken of them, attempting to kidnap a 7-year-old off a porch and being attacked by their dog. Along with this, we found that there had been several sightings of a white truck around our town following others doing similar things days after it first happened to us following cars that had a similar description to my friends and I cars. Our reports were officially filed after we saw the information of the car on Facebook, along with the identity of the man that had stalked us for years. It took years to get rid of them, but we now don't have to worry about the men anymore.